Welcome, friends. Before we begin today's story, let me gently remind you, if you love heartfelt tales about family sacrifice and the twists of life, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. And when you do leave a comment telling us where in the world you're listening from, we love knowing how far these stories travel. Now, the title of our story, My Daughter Let Her Stepfather Walk Her Down the Aisle. So I took back every dollar I paid for her wedding. Let's begin. Max was 58 years old when he found himself standing alone outside the grand wooden doors of St. Andrew's Chapel. He had imagined this day so many times over the years, the moment he would take his daughter's hand, walk her slowly down the aisle, and give her away with pride. That picture had been painted in his heart since the day she was born, but reality has a way of shattering even the strongest of dreams. From where he stood, Max could hear the faint murmur of the organ warming up inside the whispers of guests, taking their seats, the rustle of gowns, the low chatter of anticipation. The air smelled faintly of lilies and polished wood. He stood tall, wearing the same navy suit he had carefully preserved for special occasions, but his hands trembled as he adjusted his tie. Moments earlier, his daughter, his only daughter, had turned to him with eyes as cold as glass. She was radiant in her white gown veil, shimmering with pearls, her cheeks glowing. But her words cut deeper than any blade. "You're not needed here, Dad." Max felt the floor tilt beneath him. He blinked, trying to understand if he had misheard. But then the truth landed like a hammer. When he saw another man, her stepfather, reach out his arm, and she accepted it with a smile that was meant to be his. The man looked polished, wealthy, sure of himself. He wore confidence like a second skin. Guests rose to their feet as the music swelled, and Max was left on the outside. He pressed a hand against the doorframe, steadying himself, forcing air into his lungs. He could hear the swell of cannon in D echoing from the organ, the sound he had always imagined accompanying his walk with her. But it wasn't his steps echoing down the aisle. It was another man's. Inside, his daughter beamed. She looked around at the guests. But when her eyes brushed past Max, lingering at the far back, half hidden in the shadows, there was no recognition, no warmth. Just a cool, dismissive glance, as if he were an intruder at his own daughter's wedding. The guests whispered, some even turned their heads curious why the real father was sitting in silence, watching from a distance while another man claimed the honor. But no one dared speak. Max's throat ached. He wanted to shout, to say, "That's my daughter, I raised her. I built her future brick by brick, shift by shift." He wanted to remind her of nights he stayed up to pay the bills, of mornings he packed her school lunches, of years when it was just the two of them against the world. But he said nothing. His heart pounded against his ribs as he realized the truth. In the storybook of her wedding day, his page had been torn out. He was a footnote, an afterthought, perhaps even an embarrassment. Max stepped back from the door, his vision blurring. A single tear slipped down, not of weakness, but of grief. The kind of grief that comes when love is repaid with indifference. The organ thundered and the chapel erupted in applause, as his daughter walked down the aisle, holding tightly to another man's arm. Max stood in the cold hallway, clutching nothing but air, and in that hollow silence, a seed was planted. A seed of pain, a seed of betrayal. And deep within Max, though he did not know it yet, the seed of revenge began to take root. The sound of the organ still echoed in Max's ears as he walked away from the chapel door, each note digging deeper into his chest. Outside, the air was crisp, tinged with the faint sweetness of spring flowers arranged along the church's stone steps. Guests in bright dresses and polished shoes hurried past him without acknowledgement, brushing by, as if he were just another stranger loitering near the entrance. Max sat down on a low stone wall, staring at the ground. The pain in his chest wasn't just from this moment. It was years, decades piled up into one crushing weight. And as he sat there, uninvited in his own daughter's happiness, the memories came unbidden. He remembered the long nights after her mother had left. Just him, a single father working double shifts at the construction site, his hands raw from lifting steel beams and mixing cement. He'd stumble home too tired to cook, but he'd still find the strength to boil macaroni and cheese for his little girl, sitting beside her as she ate with her small plastic spoon. He remembered patching her shoes with glue because she had begged him for one more week to wear her favorite pair. He remembered walking 3 miles in the snow when his truck broke down just to pick her up from school, so she wouldn't have to wait in the cold. Every scar on his hand, every crease on his face carried her name. He had lived for her, and it wasn't just the past sacrifices. He thought about the wedding itself, how she'd cried on the phone saying she couldn't afford her dream ceremony, that she wanted something beautiful, something worthy. How could he say no? He had emptied his savings account, $50,000 built over years of careful scrimping, to give her the day she wanted. Every flower arrangement, every shimmering light in that chapel, every note of that organ, had been paid for by the man now sitting outside in silence. Max clenched his jaw. Inside laughter rose. Champagne corks popped. The joyous voices of two families blended together, but none of them belonged to him. He pictured her stepfather smiling proudly as he led her down the aisle, his polished shoes tapping against the floor Max had expected to walk. That man had money, influence, status. But had he ever patched a child's shoes with glue? Had he ever worked until his back broke just to buy textbooks? Had he ever sold his tools, the only thing he owned, so that a little girl could have a birthday party? Max's chest tightened, anger blooming alongside heartbreak. From where he sat, he could see a sliver of the stained glass windows glowing with candlelight. He imagined her standing there hand in hand with her new husband, smiling at the man beside her, introducing him to the world as though he had been her father all along. The injustice of it made Max's hands tremble. His mind drifted to the file folder locked in his desk drawer back home. Inside were receipts, bank transfers, all the evidence of his sacrifices, not only for the wedding, but for every milestone of her life. He had kept them not for recognition, but as a silent record of his devotion. Now those papers felt like weapons. Max inhaled deeply, trying to steady himself. For so long he had accepted his place in silence. He had endured the dismissive comments, the subtle ways his daughter's husband looked down on him, the way his daughter's affection had grown distant with each passing year. He had forgiven it all. But tonight something inside him shifted. Tonight, standing outside his daughter's wedding, stripped of dignity, he realized forgiveness had its limits. He was not helpless. He was not disposable. And if they thought they could erase him, they would learn just how much a father's silence could hold, how easily sacrifice could turn into retribution. Max rose from the stone wall, the chapel music fading behind him. He buttoned his suit jacket with deliberate calm, his breath steady now. The night was cool, the stars faint above the city lights. Each step away from that church felt less like retreat and more like the beginning of something else. Something his daughter would never forget. When Max returned home that night, the house felt heavier than ever before. The walls seemed to echo with silence, the kind of silence that isn't peace but abandonment. His suit still carried the faint perfume of the church flowers, but instead of comfort, the scent turned his stomach. He tossed his jacket over the arm of the recliner, loosened his tie, and stood in the dim light of his living room, unsure whether to sit or to pace. The desk in the corner drew him in the same oak desk where he'd paid bills for 20 years, where he'd written college tuition checks, where he'd budgeted every grocery trip to make sure his daughter never went without. He sat down the chair creaking beneath him and pulled open the drawer. There it was, the folder. He thumbed through the papers, page after page of proof of his devotion: bank slips, credit card bills, receipts. From bridal shops, the invoice from the banquet hall. He traced the numbers with his finger, each one a cut on his heart. $50,000. His entire life savings. And what had it bought him a seat outside the chapel? His hands shook as he pulled a sheet of paper from the drawer. He uncapped his pen slowly, the weight of it familiar, steadying. He began to write. Dear Emily, he started, the ink flowing with surprising ease. Tonight I watched you walk down the aisle with another man holding your hand. You looked radiant, but I couldn't help noticing you never looked for me. Not once. The words poured out of him like water bursting through a dam. He wrote about the nights he had carried her feverish body in his arms, the scraped knees he had bandaged, the sandwiches packed for school, the prom dress he had worked overtime to afford. He wrote about the lonely dinners since her mother left, when he would watch her push peas around her plate, and force a smile so she wouldn't feel the absence too sharply. He wrote about the sacrifices, the second job, the double shifts, the debts he had paid silently so she could have more. And finally he wrote about the wedding. I gave you $50,000, he scrawled, his pen pressing so hard the ink almost tore the paper. Money I had saved by saying no to myself for years. And tonight, with everything I gave you, told me I wasn't needed. You told me I was less than nothing. His hand stilled. The page blurred as his eyes filled, but he didn't stop. You may erase me in front of others, but you cannot erase the truth. The truth is, I built this life for you. Brick by brick, dollar by dollar. And if you think you can dismiss me, if you think you can humiliate me, you will learn that even the quietest father can roar when he has been pushed too far. He signed his name at the bottom, Dad. Max sat back, staring at the letter. His breath came hard, his pulse heavy in his ears. For a long time he considered slipping it into an envelope, mailing it to her honeymoon suite, letting her read his fury between champagne toasts. But something stopped him. It wasn't enough. A letter was too quiet, too private. Words on a page could be denied, dismissed, forgotten. His humiliation had been public before God, before guests, before an entire room of witnesses. His revenge would need to be public, too. Max folded the paper carefully and slid it back into the drawer. Not yet. He would wait. He would plan. The right moment would come, and when it did, she would understand exactly what she had done. He rose from the desk, his body tired, but his mind alive with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. The betrayal had sharpened him. In the stillness of his living room, Max whispered to the empty house, "This isn't over." The lamp cast his shadow long across the wall, not of a broken man, but of one who had just begun to sharpen the blade of his justice. The night after the wedding sleep would not come. Max lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses from the reception still replaying in his mind like a cruel echo. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Emily's face, smiling, glowing, but never once turning to look for him. And always beside her, that other man, hand firmly linked with hers, the man she had chosen to replace him. At 3 a.m., Max rose, unable to endure the silence pressing down on him. He walked barefoot through the house, each room lit faintly by the glow of streetlights outside. The kitchen still smelled faintly of coffee from the morning before the ceremony. He stopped by the mantel in the living room. There, under a thin film of dust, stood a row of photographs. He picked one up, Emily at age 5, missing her 2 front teeth, her arms wrapped around a stuffed bear. He could almost hear her laugh in that moment, the unrestrained joy of a child who still believed her father was the center of her world. He traced the frame with his thumb, his chest tightening. Another photo showed her at 16 holding the keys to her first car. That had been one of his proudest days. He remembered signing the loan papers, co-signing when her credit wasn't strong enough. He had worked 3 weekends straight to cover the down payment. The smile on her face in that picture, so wide, so trusting, had made it worth it. Max placed the photo back and picked up another, her graduation day. The cap crooked on her head, the diploma clutched in her hand. She had cried into his shoulder afterward, thanking him for pushing her, for believing in her when she wanted to quit. "You're the best dad in the world," she had whispered, and he had believed it. Now those words felt like lies. His hands shook as he set the photos down one by one. Memories layered upon memories like bricks in a wall he had built with his own blood and sweat. And now, with one sentence, "You're not needed here, Dad," she had tried to tear it all down. Max walked into the garage, flicked on the dim overhead light, and looked at the tools neatly arranged on the wall. He remembered the nights he had spent here building the dollhouse Emily had begged for one Christmas. 3 months of cutting, sanding, painting, all in secret until he unveiled it Christmas morning. She had squealed and thrown her arms around him, saying it was just like our real house. He had never forgotten the weight of that hug. But the hug she gave her stepfather in the church yesterday had been longer, stronger, public. Max leaned against the workbench, his breath ragged. He realized then that her betrayal wasn't just about the wedding. It was about years of slow erasure, little by little, until he was no longer father, but simply a placeholder she could choose to remove. And yet anger wasn't the only thing stirring in his chest. Beneath the fury, beneath the humiliation, was a grief so raw it nearly buckled his knees. He wanted to believe it was a mistake, that somehow Emily would call, would apologize, would explain. But he knew better. Max closed his eyes, and the sound of her voice from the reception came back. "Dad, you're not needed here." Needed or not, he thought grimly, she had already taken $50,000 from him. She had already used his sacrifice to build her perfect day, and she had erased him from it. His jaw tightened. If she thought he would remain erased, she had miscalculated. Max returned to his desk, opened the drawer again, and pulled out the letter he had written the night before. He read it slowly, every word stabbing him anew. Then carefully he tore it in half. A private letter would never be enough. This wasn't just about pain. It was about justice. And if she wanted to humiliate him in public, then his response would also be public. As the first light of dawn crept into the room, Max whispered, "You'll remember me, Emily, whether you want to or not." The house was silent, but in the quiet Max felt something stir. Not despair, not grief, but resolve. The morning after his sleepless night, Max brewed coffee in silence. The bitterness on his tongue matched the bitterness in his chest. He carried the mug to his desk, a heavy oak thing that had been Ellen's father's once upon a time. Inside the bottom drawer sat a weathered binder. He hadn't opened it in years. He had always called it the cost of love. It was a binder full of receipts, contracts, and handwritten notes. Ellen used to tease him about keeping everything. Someday, she'd laugh, "You'll be the only man in Denver who still has grocery receipts from the 90s. But Max hadn't kept them out of obsession. He kept them because each piece of paper represented a choice, a sacrifice, a promise fulfilled. He flipped open the binder. The first section, education. University tuition for Emily, $47,600 across 4 years. He remembered working double shifts, pouring concrete, coming home covered in dust, collapsing into Ellen's arms. "She deserves better than we had," he had told her. And Ellen, smiling through her fatigue, had whispered, "Then we'll make it happen." The next section, the wedding fund. He'd written $50 in his own handwriting on the first page. At the time, it had been money meant for his retirement. He had been 57 1 year away from paying off his own mortgage completely. But Emily had cried when she talked about her dream wedding, the dress, the ballroom, the flowers cascading from the ceiling like in the magazines. Max had caved. He had emptied savings accounts, cashed out a small annuity, and even borrowed against his truck to make the day perfect. Now, as he stared at that number, his jaw clenched. 50,000. And for what to be told in front of everyone that he was not needed. He kept turning the pages. Car loans. Rent payments when Emily lost her first job. Medical bills from the time she'd broken her leg in high school. A trip abroad she had begged for during college. Once-in-a-lifetime experience, Dad, she had said. He had sold his hunting rifles to pay for it. Page after page, sacrifice after sacrifice. The binder grew heavier with every turn, though its weight had never changed. Max leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He thought about the irony, his daughter standing on a stage, surrounded by flowers he had bought in a dress. His money had paid for holding the hand of a man who had contributed nothing, and she had dared to look him in the eye and say he wasn't needed. The rage came back like a storm, but this time it wasn't wild. It was sharp-focused. For years, he had believed that being a good father meant giving without keeping score. But now, seeing the ledger of his life laid bare, Max realized something bitter but true. Emily had mistaken his sacrifices for weakness. She had assumed the man who gave everything would always give more, even if it meant erasing himself. Max closed the binder and pressed his palms against its worn cover. No more. This binder wasn't just a record. It was evidence. Evidence of love, yes, but also evidence of betrayal, how every dollar, every sleepless night, every broken back had been repaid with disregard. He stood up and carried the binder to the mantel, placing it beneath Ellen's photograph. "You always said not to spoil her," he murmured. "But I did. And now she thinks I'm nothing. Well, Ellen, she's about to learn who I am." Max took a deep breath, his reflection caught in the glass of the photo frame. His eyes were bloodshot, but there was steel there now, too. The cost of love had been tallied, and soon everyone at that wedding banquet would see the bill. Max had tried to stay invisible that night. After Emily walked into the ballroom on another man's arm, he had retreated to the edges of the reception hall, nursing a glass of water he didn't taste. The music-swelled guests clapped. The bride and groom danced their first dance under strings of golden lights. And all the while, Max sat alone at a corner table, the shadows pooling around him like old friends. From there he could see everything. Emily laughing, her white gown trailing across the polished floor. Guests swirling around with champagne glasses clinking and cheering. The new husband beaming with pride as though he had funded every petal of every flower. But Max also heard the whispers. "They say her father paid for all this, but he's sitting over there alone," a woman murmured, her hand shielding her lips as she leaned toward her friend. "Strange, isn't it? You'd think he'd be honored at the head table," the other replied. Max clenched his jaw, his hand tightening around the stem of his glass. Honored? He wasn't even acknowledged. He was a shadow in a room he had built. Later, when the father-daughter dance was announced, a ripple of murmurs ran through the hall. Max's heart had leapt for a moment, a reflex born of decades of expectation. But it wasn't him who stood up. It was the stepfather. The man who had appeared in Emily's life only 5 years ago now, basking in the role Max had carried alone for decades. "They look so sweet," someone said behind him. "She must be so grateful to have him." Grateful. The word struck Max like a slap. Emily's head rested on the stepfather's shoulder. Her eyes closed, a smile on her face, as though he had been the one who held her through fevers, the one who stayed up nights balancing bills so she could go to college, the one who sold his rifles and dreams to pay for her trips and her wedding. No, Max thought, that man had given her nothing but his presence at the right time. And somehow, it was enough to erase him. As the dance ended, Max caught sight of a group of younger guests, whispering, their eyes flicking toward him. One of them smirked. Another shrugged as if to say he's irrelevant now. The humiliation burned hotter than the wine that trickled down his throat when he tried to swallow it away. He set the glass down hard, the sound lost in the chatter and the music, but sharp in his own ears. For the rest of the evening, the reminders piled on. The groom's father giving a toast thanking both families for their support without mentioning Max by name. Emily's smile frozen when she glanced toward him as though his presence was an inconvenience. Even the photographer, when arranging a family portrait, had skipped over Max, focusing on Emily with her new in-laws and her smiling stepfather. It was as if he were already gone. By the time dessert was served, Max had made a decision. He wasn't going to stay silent. Not anymore. The binder at home full of sacrifices was more than personal records, it was testimony. Evidence. And this crowd, these people who had chosen to erase him from his own daughter's wedding, would be his witnesses. He imagined it, the microphone in his hand, the binder open, receipts fluttering like confetti. He would tell them what love had cost him. He would tell them the truth, that this fairy tale wedding had been paid for in blood, sweat, and sleepless nights. And then, when the silence was at its thickest, he would deliver the final blow. Max sat back, his heart pounding. The whispers had cut him tonight, but soon it would be his words echoing in the hall, words that could not be ignored, not by Emily, not by her husband, not by the guests who thought he was invisible. The night wasn't over. Not yet. The house was silent when Max returned that night. The Christmas lights on the porch blinked faintly, a cheap string he'd hung himself not for celebration, but to keep some illusion of warmth in the cold. He slipped his jacket off slowly, each movement heavy, as though he were still carrying the weight of the whispers from the reception. He didn't turn on the overhead light. Instead, he walked into the living room and sat in his old recliner, the same one Ellen had favored in her final years. Her photograph was still on the mantel, framed in brass, her smile frozen in time. Max stared at it, his chest tightening until he finally whispered, "You saw it all, didn't you, Ellen?" The silence was an answer in itself. He leaned forward, rubbing his face with his hands, and the words he had heard replayed in his mind. "You're not needed here, Dad." That sentence cut deeper than any blade. He could have endured being overlooked, even mocked. But to be told plainly that his existence was unnecessary, that his role as father was obsolete, was the kind of wound that didn't stop bleeding. His eyes drifted toward the low wooden cabinet by the wall. Inside it was the binder. The thick weathered binder that held 20 years of sacrifices, tuition, receipts, the loan papers he had co-signed, bills from Emily's dream wedding. Each page carried sweat and sleepless nights. Each page was proof that he had given everything. Max rose from the recliner, the floor creaking under his weight. He crossed the room and pulled the binder free. It was heavier than it looked. He carried it back to his chair, setting it on his lap. Slowly, deliberately, he opened it. There was the $48 zero college tuition he had paid each semester, marked by a receipt that still smelled faintly of printer ink. There was the $32 zero wedding invoice, florists, catering, the ballroom, all the things Emily had demanded to make her day perfect. Max traced the numbers with his finger. "I gave her this," he whispered. "Every penny, every hour of work. And tonight I wasn't even worth a name in a toast." His hand trembled as he flipped page after page. He remembered double shifts and freezing winters, coming home with cracked hands and aching knees. He remembered Ellen's voice telling him he was working himself into the ground, but he'd answered every time, "She deserves better." Deserve. That word burned now. Because Emily had taken everything he'd given and handed the credit to another man. Max closed the binder with a heavy thud, the sound echoing through the empty room. He sat still, breathing hard, his decision forming in the silence. No more quiet suffering. No more being erased. He would show them Emily, her new husband, the stepfather, the guests who whispered that he wasn't irrelevant, that without him the wedding wouldn't have happened, and he would do it in a way they could never forget. His eyes lifted to Ellen's photo again. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I should have remembered what you told me, that giving too much can make them forget to be grateful. But I promise you this, Ellen, they'll remember me soon." For the first time in months, Max felt something other than despair. It wasn't joy. It wasn't peace. It was a hard, cold fire in his chest, the kind of resolve that sharpened his mind and steadied his hands. He rose from the chair, walked to his desk, and began to gather the pieces of his plan. The binder, the financial statements, even the old photos of Emily that reminded him of the years when she had looked at him with love, not disdain. Tonight had been their stage, but the final act would be his. Max turned off the lamp, the house sinking back into darkness. But within him, a different kind of light was burning, one that would not be extinguished until his revenge was complete. The morning sun crept through the blinds, but Max was already awake. He hadn't slept. He'd sat at his desk most of the night, the binder open like a ledger of his entire life. Each receipt was a fragment of his sacrifice, each bill a reminder of what he had given. Now, for the first time, he wasn't looking at them as records. He was looking at them as weapons. He brewed a pot of coffee, black and strong, and carried his mug back to the desk. The steam fogged his glasses, but his hands didn't tremble the way they had the night before. He was steady, methodical, the same way he had been when building the house brick by brick with his own hands. He began to sort. First, the college tuition papers, each one clipped neatly with the date written in blue pen. 4 years of double shifts of Ellen staying up late to massage the knots out of his shoulders while he calculated numbers at this very table. $48 zero in total. He stacked them together, fastening them with a large binder clip. Next, the wedding invoices. Caterers, florists, photographers, the ballroom deposit. $32 zero he didn't have, but worked himself sick to cover. He remembered Emily's tears when he had told her he could only afford a small ceremony. How she had cried until he gave in. How she had whispered, "You're the best dad in the world." And now she'd told him he wasn't even needed. He clipped the invoices together and laid them neatly beside the tuition papers. Then came the smaller debts. The first car loan he co-signed when Emily's credit had been too weak. The mortgage payments he had covered when Jeremy lost his job. The bills from the steakhouse anniversary dinner he had paid for the one that had cost nearly his entire monthly pension. Every page was proof without him their lives would have crumbled years ago. Max laid them out across the desk like evidence at a trial. He looked at the rows of paper and whispered, Let's see them call me useless after this. But it wasn't enough. Evidence alone was paper and ink. What he needed was a stage. A place where these sacrifices would be undeniable, where Emily and Jeremy couldn't hide behind polite smiles or closed doors. A place where everyone would see the truth. The thought of the wedding hall came back to him, the chandeliers, the clinking glasses, the applause when Emily and her stepfather had walked down the aisle. That had been their stage. He would need one of his own, and he knew exactly where. Christmas, the season of family, of gratitude, of joy. The time when every neighbor, every relative, every friend gathered close. They had erased him from the wedding, but they would not erase him from Christmas. This year he would host his own dinner, and at that dinner he would reveal everything. Max opened a fresh notebook and began making lists. Guests he would invite: Rosa, his sister; Mrs. Henderson from next door, who always looked after him; old friends from church who had asked about him; people who would not only listen but witness. He wrote down binder in bold letters at the top of the page. Underneath it, present evidence at dinner. Show totals. Let them see who really paid for everything. As he wrote, he imagined the moment. Emily sitting at the table trying to smile while the truth was read aloud. Jeremy, his smug expression breaking when the invoices were stacked before him, and the guest people they respected watching it all. The humiliation would not be hidden in whispers. It would be public, undeniable, complete. Max leaned back in his chair, the plan taking shape with every line he wrote. For the first time in years, he didn't feel erased. He felt alive. He lifted Ellen's photo from the mantel and placed it gently beside the binder. "You told me not to give her so much that she forgot to be grateful," he whispered. "Well, Ellen, she forgot, but I'll make sure she remembers." Outside, the first flakes of snow drifted past the window, catching in the morning light. It was still weeks until Christmas, but for Max, the season of reckoning had already begun. The snow had picked up by the next morning, coating the neighborhood in a white hush. Max stood at his kitchen window, coffee in hand, watching the flakes gather on the hedges he had trimmed himself last spring. Normally, snow meant family sledding with Emily when she was small hot chocolate by the fire, Ellen humming carols, while dinner roasted in the oven. But this year, Christmas would mean something else. This year, Christmas would be war. Max sat back at the kitchen table. The binder opened before him and picked up the phone. His first call was to Rosa, his younger sister. She had always been his fiercest defender, the one who saw through Emily's spoiled demands, even when Ellen had urged patience. "Rosa," he said when she answered, his voice steady, "I'm hosting Christmas dinner this year. I'd like you to come." There was a pause on the line, then her warm laugh. "Max, you haven't hosted in years." "Are you sure you're up for it?" "I've never been more sure," he replied. "I'll handle everything. I need you there." She didn't press. Rosa never did. "Of course. I'll be there." He marked her name on his list and moved on. Next was Mrs. Henderson, the widow next door. She was in her 70s, spry and kind, and had often slipped him pies or soups when she saw him eating alone. When he extended the invitation, her voice broke with gratitude. "Christmas dinner? Why, Max, I can't remember the last time someone asked me to one. I'll bring my cranberry tart if you don't mind." "Perfect," Max said, smiling for the first time in days. He called old friends from church, the men he'd once built houses alongside on volunteer weekends, the couples who had sent him casseroles when Ellen passed. Every one of them said yes, touched by his gesture, surprised but pleased. The list grew longer. Not just family but community. Not just dinner but witnesses. Max didn't invite Emily or Jeremy. Not yet. Their invitation would come later, and it would arrive in the most formal way possible. By afternoon, his phone call list was done. 20 guests. 20 pairs of eyes. 20 people who would hear with their own ears every sacrifice he had made and every betrayal he had endured. When the last call ended, Max leaned back in his chair. The snow outside had thickened into a storm, but he felt warm, almost feverish. He imagined the long dining table he'd set the chairs filled with people who had known him for decades, people who would not dismiss his story as bitterness. He saw Emily's face flush from embarrassment when the binder came out. He saw Jeremy, always so polished and smug, shrinking under the weight of documented truth. He could almost hear the murmurs of the guests, the sharp intake of breath, when they realized the extent of his sacrifices. This was no longer about revenge alone. This was about dignity, about reclaiming what Emily's words had tried to strip away: his worth as a father, as a man, as someone who had given everything and asked for little in return. He closed the binder and placed it carefully in the center of the table like a sacred book. Ellen's photo leaned against it, her smile frozen in time. "Don't worry, Ellen," he murmured. "They'll all know. They'll all see." The clock struck 6, the sound echoing through the quiet house. Outside, the Christmas lights he'd strung on the porch flickered to life, their glow spilling onto the snow. To anyone passing by the house, looked like a beacon of warmth, an old man preparing for a simple holiday gathering. But inside, Max was preparing something far greater, a reckoning. Max had never been one for theatrics. He was a builder, a man of simple lines and sturdy beams, not frills and showmanship. But this wasn't about preference anymore. This was about making sure his message landed sharp as a nail driven into oak. If he phoned Emily, she'd brush him off. If he texted, Jeremy would delete it with a sneer. No, this had to be different. This had to feel official. Binding. Unignorable. He sat at his desk, the same solid oak Ellen had chosen decades ago, and pulled out a fresh sheet of thick stationery. His hand, steady from years of drawing blueprints, began to write. "Emily and Jeremy, you are invited to Christmas dinner at my home 7:00 p.m. sharp. It will be a formal gathering. Please dress accordingly. I have something important to share, something about family sacrifice and legacy. It is time you hear it alongside others who care. Love, Dad." He read it twice. The words were simple, but the weight behind them was unmistakable. This wasn't the desperate plea of a lonely father. It was a summons. Max folded the letter with precision, slid it into an envelope, and sealed it. On the front, he wrote their names in block letters, the way he used to label Emily's school books when she was a child. Then, instead of dropping it in the mailbox, he drove across town. The roads were slick with fresh snow, but he didn't mind. Each turn of the tires felt like progress. By the time he pulled up outside Emily and Jeremy's pristine suburban home, Christmas lights twinkled across their porch in perfect symmetry. Their house looked like it belonged on a holiday postcard. Max couldn't help but feel the sting. She had always wanted appearances, and Jeremy had given her the money to polish every corner. He walked up the steps, his boots crunching on the salted walkway, and slid the envelope directly through the mail slot. No middlemen, no excuses. She'd find it herself. For a moment, he stood there staring at the door he'd once helped them paint when they first moved in. He could almost hear Emily's laughter as a child, her small hand in his guiding the brushstrokes on their own family home. Now that same hand would unfold this letter, not knowing it was the spark to a fire she couldn't control. Max turned and left without knocking. Back home, he set the kettle on the stove. The house was quiet, except for the whistle of the steam. He thought of Ellen again, how she would have smoothed the edges of his plan, maybe reminded him not to be cruel. But cruelty wasn't the goal. Truth was, on the kitchen counter his phone buzzed. He let it ring. He knew exactly who it was. Emily's number flashed on the screen, her reaction to the letter quicker than he'd expected. After a few rings, the call went to voicemail. Seconds later, a text appeared. "Dad, what is this, a dinner with others? Why are you being so dramatic?" Max read the words but didn't reply. He'd said all he needed to say in ink. The next time they spoke would be in front of everyone, with the binder open and the fire crackling. He poured his tea, sat at the table, and pictured Christmas night. Emily and Jeremy walking in smug, expecting perhaps another desperate attempt at reconciliation. Instead, they'd be faced with 20 witnesses, the truth laid bare, and their control slipping like snow through clenched fingers. The invitation was no longer just paper. It was a trap set, baited with formality and inevitability, and they had no choice but to walk right into it. Emily read the invitation 3 times, the paper trembling between her fingers. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, her father's handwriting, the same she remembered from the notes he used to slip into her lunchbox when she was a girl. But this wasn't a sweet reminder to eat your sandwich or good luck on your test. This was something else. Something unsettling. Jeremy, she called, her voice sharp, come here. He walked into the kitchen, wine glass in hand, wearing the smug half-smile he wore whenever he thought he had everything under control. What now? She shoved the letter at him. Read this. Jeremy scanned the lines, his brow furrowing slightly, before he let out a short laugh. A dinner with others, please. It's a guilt trip. Classic old man move. Emily shook her head. No, this is different. Look how he wrote it. Formal gathering, something important to share. And in front of other people, what does that even mean? Jeremy sipped his wine and leaned against the counter. It means he's lonely, He wants attention. Probably wants to play victim in front of the neighbors. Nothing we haven't seen before. But Emily wasn't convinced. She traced the signature love dad with her fingertip. There was no pleading in the words. No begging like before. There was a firmness she hadn't seen in years. It unsettled her. What if he's planning something? She whispered. Jeremy scoffed. Like what, he's an old man with a house and some stories. He's not dangerous. If anything, we should go. Make an appearance, smile for the crowd, then we're back in control. Emily frowned, remembering the Christmases of her childhood, when her father's stern silences were scarier than any raised voice. He'd built their home with his own 2 hands, worked double shifts so she could go to college. That man had been strong, unyielding. Lately, he had seemed small, bent, almost invisible. But what if that man was still in there? What if he embarrasses us? She asked. What if he tells people things? Jeremy chuckled and placed a hand on her shoulder. Let him. Who's going to care if your neighbor's a pastor? Nobody important. They all already think he's pitiful. The more he talks, the more foolish he'll look. Still, Emily couldn't shake the unease coiling in her chest. She glanced at the letter again, her father's words echoing in her mind. It is time you hear it alongside others who care. Others who care. It was as though he was drawing a line in the sand, choosing his allies. And for the first time in her life, Emily felt the faintest chill of being on the wrong side of her father's judgment. That night, as Jeremy scrolled through his phone in bed, Emily stared at the ceiling, sleepless. She thought of her father's quiet eyes, the way he'd once hugged her so tightly on her wedding day she could barely breathe. She thought of the sacrifices she rarely admitted, the tuition bills, the mortgage payments, the countless hours of sweat and dust. And then she thought of the look in his eyes last Christmas when she'd brushed him off, when she'd told him it was simpler if he stayed home. The silence that followed still haunted her. Now he wasn't silent. He was speaking, and he had an audience waiting. Emily turned on her side, away from Jeremy's steady breathing. The unease wouldn't let her rest. Whatever her father had planned, she realized with a shiver he would not be the fool at that dinner. Max folded the last envelope with deliberate care. His handwriting was steady, not rushed or sloppy, each name penned as though it carried weight. Mrs. Henderson, across the street. Rosa, his sister. Pastor Williams from the church. Even a couple of old friends from his construction days whom he hadn't spoken to in years. Each invitation was clear Christmas Eve dinner at his home. Formal. Important. He sealed the envelope, pressed his thumb against the flap, and sat back in his chair. The stack of letters looked small, almost innocent. But to Max, they were dynamite. Each one was a fuse leading to the moment he'd been building toward, the moment he would stop being erased, stop being treated as a burden. On the dining table before him lay a different stack, a binder thick and heavy. Inside were 2 decades' worth of receipts, mortgage statements, tuition payments, and handwritten notes. A paper trail of sacrifice. He turned the pages slowly, the sound of shuffling paper echoing in the quiet house. He lingered on the page that showed the final mortgage payment, the one he'd covered even after his son and daughter-in-law had moved in. The words stamped PAIDINFULL were as sharp as a blade. He closed the binder and whispered, "This time you'll see. Not just them, everyone." The next morning, Max visited the local grocery store. As he pushed the cart down the aisles, he chose carefully prime cuts of beef, fresh vegetables, a bottle of wine he'd been saving for years. People smiled as they passed, some stopping to exchange pleasantries. "Hosting something big, Max?" the butcher asked, wrapping the rib roast. Something like that, Max replied, his lips curving into a thin smile. A special night. The butcher chuckled. Well, whoever's coming is lucky. Not many folks cook like you anymore. Lucky, Max thought, though his guests wouldn't feel that way once the night ended. At home, he set the groceries neatly on the counter and walked into the living room. He glanced around the space, imagining it filled neighbors, settling into chairs, Rosa setting down her casserole past her, Williams bowing his head to say grace. And in the center, Emily and Jeremy forced to sit, forced to listen. He rehearsed it in his mind the moment he would rise from his chair, the binder in his hands, his voice firm. Not loud, not angry, just undeniable. He pictured the silence falling across the room, as the evidence spread before them, his sacrifices, his money, his house. And then the final blow, the announcement that the mortgage had been canceled, that the house his son treated like his kingdom was no longer theirs to claim. The thought made Max's chest swell with both pain and pride. Pain for all the years, wasted pride for the strength he'd found to take it back. Meanwhile, across town, Emily sat at her vanity mirror, brushing her hair with quick, nervous strokes. The letter from her father lay folded on the nightstand, but its words might as well have been etched into her mind. She could still hear Jeremy's dismissive laugh, but her instincts told her this wasn't just a lonely old man's cry for attention. It was a trap. She didn't know what kind yet, but she knew her father well enough to sense it. What's he planning? She whispered to her reflection. She thought of calling him demanding answers, but something stopped her. Fear, maybe? Fear that if she asked, he would tell her and she wouldn't be ready to hear it. Behind her, Jeremy walked into the room. You're overthinking this. We go, we smile, we leave. That's all. Emily nodded, though the pit in her stomach remained. She knew her father wasn't smiling anymore. That night, Max sat by the fireplace, the binder resting on his lap. The flames flickered across his weathered face as he stared into the fire, lost in thought. He was no longer just a father waiting for an invitation to Christmas. He was a man preparing for battle. A battle not with fists or shouting, but with truth paper and fire. He whispered again into the quiet, It's almost time. Christmas Eve arrived draped in snow, a quiet blanket across the neighborhood. Max stood at his front window watching the flakes drift under the glow of the streetlight. His house, once silent and empty, now smelled of roast beef and rosemary. The tree in the corner flickered with warm white lights. It looked like the picture of peace, but Max knew tonight would be anything but peaceful. He adjusted the collar of his pressed shirt, ran a hand over the binder resting on the sideboard, and checked the envelopes again. Everything was in place. The first knock came at 6 o'clock sharp. Max Merry Christmas, Mrs. Henderson, wrapped in her red wool coat, stood with a tin of sugar cookies. Her eyes softened when she looked at him. It's good to see you hosting again. Been too long. Come in, Eleanor, Max said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. It's a full house tonight. Soon after Rosa arrived, cheeks flushed from the cold, carrying a casserole dish hot enough to fog her glasses. She hugged Max tightly, whispering in his ear, You're brave, brother. But I'm worried. I'm worried. Just don't let this eat you alive. Max squeezed her hand. Don't worry. Tonight, they'll finally see. By 7, the living room was buzzing. Neighbors mingled glasses, clinked, the fire crackled. Pastor Williams said a short blessing before the meal, thanking God for family and community. Everyone smiled warmth, filling the room, everyone except Emily and Jeremy. They arrived late, sweeping in with designer coats and smiles plastered too wide. Emily's eyes darted around the room, quickly settling on her father. Jeremy clapped Max on the back, too loud, too casual. Dad, this is a surprise, Jeremy said, his voice a shade too cheerful. Didn't expect such a crowd. Max met his gaze calmly. Christmas should be shared. Don't you think? Emily forced a laugh, but her hands tightened around her purse strap. Something about the atmosphere unnerved her. The way neighbors looked at Max with respect, the way Rose's watchful eyes flicked between them. Dinner began. Plates passed around, voices overlapping. Laughter filled the air, yet beneath it all, there was a tension, like an invisible wire pulled taut. Max sat at the head of the table, quiet listening. Occasionally he glanced at the binder resting in the corner. His chest tightened with anticipation. Jeremy raised his glass. To family, he said, his voice booming as though daring Max to challenge him. To family, everyone echoed, though Rosa's voice cracked with irony. Max only nodded, eyes steady on his son-in-law. As the meal wound down, the room settled into a quieter hum. The roast was nearly gone, the wine bottles emptying. Mrs. Henderson told a story about her grandchildren. Pastor Williams laughed with Rosa, and the clinking of forks slowed. That's when Max rose from his chair. The chatter stilled. He held his glass in one hand, the weight of his words already pressing against his chest. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice low but commanding. "It means more than you know. I wanted this Christmas to be different. Not just for me, but for all of us. For the truth." Emily shifted in her chair. Jeremy leaned back, crossing his arms, trying to look unfazed. Max's gaze swept the table, pausing on every face before landing on his daughter. "I have something to share. Something long overdue." He walked slowly to the sideboard, lifted the heavy binder, and placed it on the table with a thud that made several people jump. Paper's years of sacrifice lay between him and his guests. "This," Max said, his eyes glinting in the firelight, "is the story of everything I've given. Every bill, every mortgage payment, every dollar poured into making sure my son had a future. Tonight you'll all know what that cost me and what it meant." The room went silent. Even the fire seemed to hold its breath. Emily's fork slipped from her fingers, clattering against her plate. Her face paled. Jeremy's jaw tightened, though his smirk didn't return. It had begun. Max placed the binder squarely in the center of the dining table between the half-empty wine glasses and dessert plates. The worn leather cover looked almost out of place among the polished silverware and holiday candles, but his hand lingered on it as though it were more valuable than gold. "Every page here," Max began, his voice steady, "is a record. Of hours I worked. Bills I paid. Mortgages I kept afloat. Sacrifices I made for my son and for the family he wanted to build." He looked around at his guests, Mrs. Henderson leaning forward, Rosa gripping her napkin, Pastor Williams quietly folding his hands as if in prayer. Then his gaze landed on Emily and Jeremy. "I think it's time you all saw what those sacrifices looked like." With a deliberate motion, he opened the binder. The first page held faded receipts yellowed at the edges. Max slid it out and held it up. 20 years ago, when we nearly lost the house, I worked double shifts at the construction site. I paid the arrears, on the mortgage, $18,400. Every cent came from my calloused hands and broken back. He laid the paper flat for all to see. "Without this payment, there would have been no home for you, Emily. No roof over your head during high school, no safe bed where you cried after heartbreaks. I kept us standing." A murmur rippled around the table. "Mrs. Henderson pressed her lips, tight eyes glistening. Rosa whispered, "I remember that winter. He worked until midnight every night." Emily shifted uncomfortably, her fingers tightening around her wine glass. Max turned another page. This one showed tuition bills. University of Colorado, $48.00. Paid across 4 years. I remember driving home with dust in my hair, my knees sore from kneeling on concrete just to sit at this very table and write checks so my son could have an education. He promised he'd make me proud, and I was proud until he forgot who gave him the chance. His voice cracked for a moment, but he steadied it quickly. He wanted strength, not pity. Jeremy smirked, though his face betrayed strain. "Come on, Dad. Everyone pays for their kids' college. That's normal." Max's eyes snapped to him. "Normal? You think breaking my body in half to pay 2 tuitions while burying your mother was normal? Don't you dare cheapen that." The table fell silent. Max flipped again. A wedding invoice appeared. Florists, caterers, venue rental. $32, zero total. Emily's wedding. She wanted her dream day. Said she couldn't live with a cheap ceremony. I told her we could afford $5,000, maybe $8,000. She cried. So I worked Saturdays and Sundays hauling lumber, installing floors, just to make sure she had the day she wanted. She called me the best father in the world during our dance. His eyes locked on Emily now, whose face burned crimson. But now, I wasn't even worthy to walk her down the aisle. Gasps spread around the room. Rosa shook her head, tears brimming. "Pastor Williams," whispered, "Lord have mercy." Emily sputtered, "Dad, that's not fair." Things were complicated, no, Max cut in sharply, his voice slicing through her protest. "It's very simple. You erased me, but you cashed every check I wrote. Page after page, he laid down evidence, car loans, he'd co-signed hospital bills, he'd covered even Jeremy's BMW transmission he'd paid for. $3,000 for this man's luxury car," Max said, holding the invoice high, while I drove a truck with rust on the doors. The neighbors exchanged uneasy glances. The humiliation was growing palpable. Jeremy tried to laugh, a hollow sound. "You're making it sound worse than it was. We plan to pay you back." Max slammed the binder, shut the echo jolting the room. His voice thundered now. "Pay me back, you called me a burden. You said I ruined your vibe. You plotted to erase me from Christmas, from my own family. Well, tonight, I erased the lie that I was ever nothing more than a weight around your neck." The silence that followed was suffocating. Emily's eyes filled with tears, but no one moved to comfort her. Jeremy's jaw clenched, but he looked away, his confidence unraveling under the weight of witnesses. Max straightened, placing both hands on the binder. His next words came low and firm. "I didn't gather you all here for sympathy. I gathered you for the truth. And we're only getting started." The fire cracked behind him. Outside, snow fell heavier. And inside, every guest knew they were watching a reckoning unfold. For a moment, no one breathed. The binder, now shut, sat on the table like a verdict already delivered. Mrs. Henderson was the first to break the silence. The elderly widow who had watched Max shovel snow from her driveway year after year leaned forward, her voice trembling, but sharp. "I knew you gave so much, Max. But I never realized the extent. My goodness. 48,000 for tuition, 32,000 for a wedding, thousands more for cars and bills. And now they treat you like you're disposable." Her words were not cruel, but they rang with condemnation. Everyone's eyes shifted to Emily and Jeremy. Rosa, Max's younger sister, folded her arms across her chest. Her gaze burned into Emily. "You told me last summer, Emily, that Dad was getting difficult, that you needed space. I thought maybe you were overwhelmed, new marriage responsibilities. But hearing this, you weren't overwhelmed. You were ungrateful." Emily's lips parted, but nothing came out. She reached for her glass, then put it down without drinking. Her hands trembled slightly. Jeremy, trying to salvage the moment, forced a laugh. "All right. Everyone, let's not make this into some kind of public trial. Family has disagreements. It's normal." "No, Jeremy," Pastor Williams interjected, his deep voice cutting through. "This isn't a disagreement. This is betrayal. I've buried men in this very community who worked less and gave less than Max, yet they were honored as heroes by their children. Max gave his blood, his labor, his soul, and in return he was cast aside." The pastor's words echoed like a sermon. The tension in the room grew heavier. The Christmas lights outside twinkled faintly through the frosted window, their cheerful glow mocking the bitter scene inside. Mrs. Patel, who lived down the street and had brought homemade cookies, spoke next. "Max was the one who repaired our fence after that big storm. He never asked for money, only said just pay it forward someday. That's the man I know. And you," she turned her head slowly toward Jeremy, her eyes narrowing, "you let him cover your car repairs while you drove around like a prince." Jeremy's jaw tightened. "That's between family. You don't understand." But the room was no longer his to command. Max stayed silent, watching, letting the neighbors speak truths he'd carried alone for too long. "You're lucky, Emily," Mrs. Henderson whispered, shaking her head. "Do you know how many of us wish our fathers had lived long enough to walk us down the aisle, and you gave that honor to another man while your father stood outside?" Emily's face turned scarlet. That's not fair. But Rosa interrupted, her voice sharp. Fair, you think fair is Dad working himself half to death for your dream wedding while you erased him from the pictures? No, Emily. You don't know the meaning of fair. The room was splitting into sides, and it was clear where the balance lay. The community, the witnesses, the friends, they were all with Max. Emily and Jeremy, for the first time, seemed cornered. Jeremy's temper finally broke. He slammed his palm on the table, rattling the silverware. Enough, so he spent money. That doesn't mean he owns us. That doesn't mean we have to keep catering to an old man who refuses to move on. The words hung in the air like smoke. Then Mrs. Henderson, frail but resolute, spoke the line that gutted him. No, Jeremy. But it does mean you owe him respect. And tonight you've proven you don't even know what that word means. The murmur of agreement rose from every corner of the table. Nods, soft claps of hands on wood, whispers of amen. Max finally rose from his chair. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. You see, Emily, Jeremy, I didn't need to humiliate you. You've done that yourselves. These people, this community, they see who you are now. And they see who I am. That's the only truth I wanted laid bare tonight. The neighbors nodded in unison. Some even reached across the table, touching Max's shoulder, his arm offering silent solidarity. Emily's tears spilled freely now. Jeremy sat rigid, his jaw clenched, but his silence spoke louder than any protest. Outside, snow fell thicker, the sound muffled against the windows, as though the whole world had leaned closer to hear this reckoning. And for the first time in years, Max felt the weight lifting. He wasn't alone anymore. His truth was out, and the tide had turned. The roast had grown cold. No one reached for seconds anymore. Forks rested, untouched wine glasses sat half full, and the glow of candles flickered like small flames of judgment. The Christmas dinner, once meant to be warm and celebratory, had transformed into a tribunal, and Emily and Jeremy were squarely in the dock. Max hadn't said much since the binder reveal. He didn't need to. Every word his neighbors, his sister, and his pastor spoke cut deeper than anything he could have planned. And the silence of the others, those who shifted uncomfortably in their seats, who avoided Emily's eyes, spoke volumes too. Emily dabbed her eyes with a napkin, her voice breaking. I never meant to hurt you, Dad. I just thought you thought he was in the way. Rosa snapped, her patience gone. Say it. You thought your father was an embarrassment? You thought money mattered more than the man who gave it. Jeremy, unwilling to be cornered, leaned back with an arrogant sneer. You all think you're so righteous. But family doesn't mean a man gets to control us with his wallet. Max could have kept his money if he wanted. He gave it freely. That was his choice. Pastor Williams raised a brow. Freely, no son. A gift given in love expects only gratitude, respect, and remembrance. Not erasure. The guests murmured. Heads shook. Mrs. Henderson's voice cracked with outrage. You lived under his roof, ate his food, drove cars he paid to fix, sat at a table he built with his own hands. And then her finger trembled as she pointed at Jeremy. You talk about him like he's a burden. Shame on you. Jeremy's face flushed with fury. We're not going to sit here and let everyone gang up on us. You already sat here while we watched your true colors, Rosa retorted, her voice ringing like a gavel. Emily buried her face in her hands. Jeremy, stop. Please just stop. But Jeremy stood defiant, his chair scraping the hardwood floor. This whole dinner is a setup. He invited you all here just to make us look bad. You think this proves anything? He can't buy dignity with receipts. He's just enough. The single word came from Max. Calm, firm, steady. His voice carried more authority in that moment than Jeremy's shouts ever could. Max rose slowly, his hands resting on the edge of the table. His eyes traveled over each face, neighbors, friends, his sister, his pastor. Finally, his gaze locked on Emily and Jeremy. You call this a setup, Jeremy? No. This was the truth finally being spoken aloud. The truth I've carried for too long in silence while you used my love as currency. The room hushed. Even the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to pause. Max's tone softened, but the weight behind his words grew heavier. Every nail in that house, every brick, every dollar was sacrifice. Not to own you, but to build a family. And now I see clearly the only people who valued that family are sitting around this table, but not you. Emily lifted her head, eyes red and swollen. Dad, please don't say that you made your choice. Emily Max cut her off. You chose shame over gratitude. And Jeremy, his voice hardened. You chose greed. Jeremy opened his mouth to retort, but a chorus of voices rose before he could speak. She's right, whispered Mrs. Patel. Max deserves better, someone else muttered. You're a disgrace, Rosa spat. The judgment of the community had been sealed. Then, with deliberate calm, Max reached for his wine glass. He lifted it high, the candlelight glinting against the deep red liquid. To Christmas, he said softly. To truth. And to the end of being silent. He drank, slowly, purposefully, and when he set the glass down, the table erupted in quiet applause, not for the speech, but for the man reclaiming his dignity. Jeremy sat back down, beaten not by argument, but by the sheer force of public shame. Emily wept silently, her fork untouched, her meal forgotten. The dinner had turned. The festive gathering was now a courtroom, and the verdict had been delivered before dessert. But Max wasn't done. Tonight was only the beginning. Because the binder of receipts was nothing compared to the fire waiting in the hearth, the fire that would consume mortgage papers and strip away the last illusion of their entitlement. The crackle of the fireplace filled the silence left behind by the applause. Shadows danced on the walls, bending across garlands and ornaments as if the house itself was alive, watching, waiting. Max stood near the hearth, his back straight, his hands steady. The binder still lay on the table, thick with decades of sacrifice, its pages like bricks of evidence against those who had betrayed him. The guests were quiet now. Their eyes followed him as he picked it up, his fingers brushing the worn leather cover. He ran a thumb along its edge like a man holding the weight of his entire life. Rosa's eyes narrowed with suspicion, sensing something coming. Mrs. Henderson leaned forward, her breath caught. Emily wiped her cheeks with trembling fingers while Jeremy muttered under his breath, trying to recover his composure. Max turned toward the fire. The flames glowed warmly, their rhythm steady like a heartbeat. He opened the binder, slowly letting the sound of rustling paper fill the room. He lifted one page, a receipt for Emily's college tuition, and held it up in the firelight. I worked 2 jobs for this, Max, said his voice low, but cutting through the quiet like a knife. I missed nights of sleep, gave up my health just so you could have a future. He glanced at Emily, his daughter's face crumbling. And yet you erased me from yours. He let the page slip from his fingers. The flames hissed, swallowing the paper instantly. Gasps echoed around the room. Jeremy scoffed, trying to regain ground. So, what burning receipts doesn't change anything. You gave that money. It's gone. But Max ignored him. He turned another page, Emily's wedding expenses. The bill for flowers, the catering, the dress. He raised it high. $32,000, he said. I told you I couldn't afford it. You cried. You begged for your dream wedding. I gave in because I loved you. And now you walk past me at that same wedding like I'm nothing. The page fluttered into the fire. A burst of flame leapt high, illuminating the horror in Emily's eyes. Mrs. Patel whispered, Dear God. Max flipped further. Receipts for groceries when Jeremy lost his job? Mortgage payments, electricity bills, thousands upon thousands. Each one he tore free, held to the light, spoke of the sacrifice, then dropped into the fire. This whoosh was your rent. This crackle was your food. This snap was your car repair. Each piece vanished into ash. The fire grew hungrier, brighter, as if feeding on the years of betrayal themselves. Emily sobbed openly now. Dad, please stop. You're making a scene. Max turned sharply. No, Emily. You made the scene. When you told me I wasn't needed at your wedding. When you erased me at Christmas. Tonight everyone will see exactly who you are and who I am. The words hung heavy, undeniable. Jeremy stood abruptly. You're humiliating us. Mac's laugh was bitter sharp. Humiliation, no son. This is liberation. He reached into the back of the binder and pulled out the thickest document of all, the mortgage statement. A 20-year burden he had carried, every payment made, every dollar earned with sweat and broken bones. He raised it above his head. This house, this roof, this life, you live in it because I carried it. And tonight, I free myself of it. The room froze. Even the fire seemed to pause, waiting. Max's hands did not shake as he fed the mortgage into the flames. The fire roared, rising high, devouring the document, like it had waited its entire life for this meal. Gasps and murmurs erupted, neighbors whispering, Rosa covering her mouth, Mrs. Henderson clutching her chest. The symbolism was clear. The mortgage, the very foundation of their entitlement, was gone. Max turned back to face them, the orange glow painting his face with a fierce, almost holy light. I am not your burden. I am not your bank. I am not invisible. Tonight, I erase every debt, every sacrifice, every chain that tied me to your ungratefulness. He spread his arms, palms open, as if presenting his freedom to the room. I owe you nothing, and you own nothing of me. Applause broke out. First Rosa, clapping with tears in her eyes. Then Mrs. Henderson, her hands trembling but proud. Soon the whole room echoed with claps, cheers, affirmations. Bravo, Max, you tell them that's dignity. Jeremy's face burned crimson. His jaw clenched tight. Emily sat slumped, broken, her sobs drowned by the noise. Max raised his voice above the applause. A final thunderous declaration: from this night on, I walk free. And you will never mistake my love for weakness again. The fire snapped, sparks flying upward like tiny stars, sealing the moment in memory. The binder was gone. The debt was gone. The silence of sacrifice had been replaced by the roar of dignity. And though the night was not yet over, the revenge had already begun to taste sweet. The fire's crackle mellowed into glowing embers, but the room itself was ablaze with energy. Applause still rang in Max's ears like thunder, echoing louder than the voice of his ungrateful children. For the first time in decades, he wasn't just a quiet provider sitting in the shadows. He was the center, seen, heard, respected. Mrs. Henderson pressed forward first, her frail hands reaching for his arm. Her eyes shimmered in the firelight. Max, that was the bravest thing I've ever witnessed. You burned the chains they tied you with. Her words loosened something deep inside him, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Pride. Around the room, neighbors began speaking up, voices rising like a chorus. I remember when Max fixed my roof in the middle of a storm, said Mr. Thompson, his cane tapping against the hardwood floor. Didn't ask for a dime, just said, that's what neighbors do. And this is the thanks he gets. He shook his head with disgust, eyes narrowing at Emily and Jeremy. Mrs. Patel, who had been silent until now, stood tall. He bought groceries for my family when my husband was laid off. My children still talk about how he carried the bags into our kitchen and told them no one in this neighborhood goes hungry. She turned her sharp gaze on Emily. And you dare call him a burden? Emily's sobs deepened, but Jeremy tried to salvage control, raising his voice above the clamor. You don't understand. This is family business. It's private, but the community only grew louder, their voices fierce. Private, you wanted him erased, Mrs. Henderson snapped back. And you would succeeded if he hadn't stood up tonight. A younger neighbor, Carlos, who had grown up down the street, stepped forward. His voice carried weight because everyone remembered Max teaching him how to ride a bike on these very sidewalks. When my dad left, it was Max who showed me how to throw a baseball. He didn't just help his own family, he was everyone's father here. Carlos looked straight at Emily. You don't deserve him. The words hit Emily harder than fire ever could. She buried her face in her hands, but Jeremy's jaw only clenched tighter, his pride bleeding through every vein. Then Father O'Leary, the local priest, rose from his chair near the back. His white collar gleamed against the dim light, and when he spoke, the room hushed. I've known Max for 30 years. I've watched him work himself raw to build a better life, not only for his daughter, but for everyone around him. What I've seen tonight is not the burden of an old man, but the dignity of one. And if you, Emily and Jeremy, cannot see it, then perhaps it is you who are the burden." The statement landed heavy. Heads nodded all around, a wave of agreement swelling through the guests. Max stood quietly, letting the voices of his community wash over him. This wasn't his revenge alone anymore. It was justice shared by all who had seen his sacrifices. Jeremy stepped forward, anger flickering in his eyes. "This is humiliation. You've all been manipulated," but Mrs. Henderson shot back, her voice quivering yet firm. "No, Jeremy. We've all just been reminded of the truth. And it's you who's been exposed. Tonight, in front of everyone, you've lost the respect you never earned." The crowd murmured in agreement. Someone clapped again, then another, until once more the room erupted in applause, not for revenge now, but for recognition. Max hadn't just freed himself. He had been restored. Max raised a hand, silencing them gently. "I didn't do this for applause. I did it because I spent too many years believing my silence was love. But love isn't letting yourself be erased. Love isn't sacrifice without respect. Tonight I took my voice back, and I thank you all for hearing it." The room fell silent again, not out of shame but reverence. Jeremy glared, his face pale with fury, but he could no longer speak. Emily, trembling, sat crumpled in her chair, her world collapsing under the judgment of witnesses she could never silence. Max turned back to the fireplace, watching the ashes of the binder drift upward in glowing curls. His heart, once heavy with debt and disappointment, now felt lighter than it had in decades. The revenge had been delivered. But more than that, justice had found its place in the open, where everyone could see it. And Max knew this was only the beginning. By the next morning, the night's embers had cooled, but the fire Max had lit inside his community was only beginning to spread. Word traveled fast in a neighborhood like theirs. Mrs. Henderson, who'd seen everything with her sharp old eyes, mentioned it first during her morning walk to the bakery. By the time she returned with her paper bag of rolls, she overheard two younger moms on the corner whispering, "Did you hear what happened at Max's? He burned every bill he ever paid for Emily and Jeremy right there in front of everyone." By noon, the story had hopped fences and coffee shops. At Rosa's grocery store, customers lingered longer than usual by the checkout counter, piecing the story together. 20 years of mortgage payments, and he showed the receipts, then straight into the fire. One man clapped his hands together in awe. Can you imagine the look on their faces at the church office? Father O'Leary received calls from parishioners who hadn't even been there. "Is it true, Father?" that Max finally stood up to them. The priest simply nodded, though his lips curled into the faintest smile. "It is true," he confirmed, "and it was righteous." By the afternoon, Jeremy and Emily could feel the weight of eyes on them wherever they went. When they tried to step into the cafe downtown, silence fell. Conversations halted mid-sentence. The barista, who usually greeted them with forced politeness, simply turned her back. Jeremy's temper snapped quickly. "What are you all staring at? This is none of your business," but the cafe owner, wiping down a counter, replied coolly, "Family or not, you don't treat a man like Max that way. Not here." The couple left, faces burning. The humiliation Max had planted inside his living room had bloomed into something larger: public disgrace. Meanwhile, Max walked through town with an ease he hadn't felt in years. At the hardware store, the young clerk, who usually treated him like a forgetful old man, now grinned wide. "Mr. Max, heard you gave him a real Christmas surprise. About time someone showed him what respect means." At the diner, the waitress poured his coffee for free, patting his shoulder. "For you, Max. On the house. We all heard what happened. You did what any father dreams of doing, standing up for himself." Max didn't bask in the praise. He wasn't built for that. But the warmth that followed him was undeniable. For so long, he had been invisible, just an old man, a background figure. Now people looked at him differently, not as a burden, but as someone who had drawn a line and reclaimed his dignity. News even reached beyond the neighborhood. A cousin from 2 towns over called Rosa after seeing a Facebook post. "Is it true your brother burned mortgage papers in front of his daughter Lord? That's something out of a movie." Rosa laughed over the phone. "It's true. He finally had his say, and now everyone's listening." At the same time, Emily and Jeremy's reputations collapsed like wet cardboard. Jeremy's employer, who had already been wary of him, overheard enough gossip to put the final nail in his career. "If he can't even handle his own family, how can I trust him with clients' money?" the boss muttered before forwarding termination papers. Emily's social circle wasn't kinder. Her bridesmaids, who had once swooned at her wedding, now whispered, "Imagine humiliating your own father like that." Invitations dried up. Calls went unanswered. The same friends who once envied her perfect life now shook their heads with pity or contempt. That night, as Max sat by his modest fireplace sipping tea, Rosa joined him. She leaned in and whispered, "Do you realize what you've done? You didn't just take your dignity back, you've turned the tide. They can't hide this. They'll live with this shame long after the paper's burned." Max exhaled slowly, staring into the flames. "It wasn't just about punishing them, Rosa. It was about making sure everyone knew silence is not love. A man deserves respect for what he's given." Outside, carolers' voices carried through the cold December air, their harmony soft but resolute. It felt almost poetic, like the world itself was echoing his message, no more being erased. Emily and Jeremy sat locked in their silent house blinds drawn phones, buzzing with unanswered texts. But outside those walls, the town had already made its judgment. Max's revenge wasn't just personal anymore. It had become a story, a warning, a lesson, and for many a source of satisfaction. And in that satisfaction, Max found something sweeter than victory: freedom. The knock came late on a Sunday afternoon, soft at first, then harder as though hesitation had given way to desperation. Max had been mending a loose chair leg in his living room when he heard it. He set down the screwdriver, wiped his hands on an old rag, and walked slowly to the door. Through the window, he saw Jeremy's car idling at the curb, shiny but bearing the weight of unpaid bills and repossession threats. When Max opened the door, it wasn't Jeremy standing there, but his son Daniel. His face was pale, his eyes restless like a boy caught between guilt and pride. "Dad," Daniel said, his voice low-strained, "we need to talk." Max studied him for a long moment, the same son who once ran across a baseball diamond, grinning as Max cheered from the bleachers. The same son who now looked like a man hollowed out by arrogance and its collapse. "Come in," Max said evenly, stepping aside. Daniel entered, glancing at the modest home, at the aging furniture, at the photographs Rosa had helped Max reframe and hang proudly after Christmas Eve. His gaze lingered on the mantel where Ellen's picture still held court. He swallowed hard. "Dad, everyone's talking about what you did?" Daniel began. His tone wavered between accusation and admiration. "You embarrassed us. You made us look like fools in front of the whole community." Max didn't flinch. He folded his arms across his chest. "No, Daniel. You did that yourselves. I just held up the mirror." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I didn't mean those words about you being too old a burden. Jenna, she gets in my head. She doesn't understand what you mean to me. But I do. I've made mistakes." "Made mistakes," Max's voice cut sharper now. "Son, mistakes are forgetting an anniversary. Mistakes are missing a phone call. What you did was different. You raised me. You erased your own father, so you could build a life on the back of my sacrifices." Daniel's shoulders slumped. He dragged a hand over his face. "I know. And now, everything's falling apart. Jeremy's out of a job. Jenna's furious with me. People don't want to talk to us anymore. I can't walk into the store without feeling eyes on me. Dad, I don't know how to fix this." Max's heart tugged at the sight, his boy reduced to shame. But he remembered the cold words, the empty chair at Christmas, the years of being treated like an obligation. He remembered the receipts, the mortgages, the bills all burned to ash in his fireplace. "You can't fix this by asking me to undo what's been done," Max said firmly. "I won't bail you out again. I won't be your safety net while you treat me like a burden. Respect isn't owed, it's earned. And you lost it." Daniel's voice cracked. "I'm not asking for money, Dad. I'm asking for another chance. I need you. Not the house, not the inheritance. Just you, my father. For the first time in years, Max saw not the grown man who had betrayed him, but the boy who once cried after striking out in Little League, running into his father's arms for comfort. For a brief moment, Max's resolve trembled. He stepped closer, placing a hand on Daniel's shoulder. I'll always be your father. Nothing will change that. But you need to understand something, son? Blood ties don't excuse cruelty. If you want me in your life, it has to be because you see me as family, not as a wallet, not as a burden, but as a man who gave everything for you. Tears welled in Daniel's eyes, though pride kept them from falling. I understand, Dad. I swear I do. Max let his hand fall away. Then prove it. Not with words. With how you live from now on. Silence stretched between them. Outside, the winter sun was setting, streaking the sky in bruised orange and gray. Daniel finally nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. Thank you for not shutting the door on me. Max watched him walk back to the car, shoulders hunched, carrying the weight of his own disgrace. When the door closed, Rosa appeared from the kitchen doorway, her face thoughtful. You softened, didn't you? Max exhaled deeply. He's still my son, but forgiveness isn't free. This time he'll have to earn it. Rosa nodded. And that might be the hardest revenge of all. Max sank back into his chair, staring into the fire. It wasn't the dramatic flames of receipts and mortgage papers, but a quieter fire, a reminder that revenge wasn't always about humiliation. Sometimes it was about reclaiming dignity and setting the terms for love itself. The Sunday after Daniel's visit, Max awoke to the smell of cinnamon. For a moment, half dreaming, he thought Ellen was in the kitchen again, baking her famous rolls. But when he opened his eyes, it was Rosa's laughter floating through the house. She'd let herself in with the spare key he'd given her years ago. Rosa stood in the kitchen, her silver hair tucked under a knitted cap, pulling a tray from the oven. Beside her, Mrs. Henderson from next door was setting plates on the table. And two young boys, Rosa's grandsons, were darting around the dining room, placing napkins like it was some great adventure. Good morning, sleepyhead, Rosa teased, catching Max leaning in the doorway. You didn't think you'd spend another Sunday alone, did you? Max smiled despite himself. I should have known you were up to something. The table was set fuller than it had been in years. Scrambled eggs, cinnamon rolls, ham, a pot of strong coffee. But more than the food, it was the voices filling his house, voices that overlapped and tangled like threads weaving a tapestry. As everyone settled down, Max found himself at the head of the table. He hadn't sat there since Ellen passed away, since family dinners dissolved into silence. But Rosa had pulled out the chair deliberately. This is still your house, Max, she said softly. Sit where you belong. He lowered himself into the chair, eyes stinging. Around him, plates clattered, coffee poured, children giggled. The air hummed with something he hadn't felt in years, belonging. Grandpa Max, can you pass the syrup? Rosa's youngest grandson asked shyly. The words caught him off guard. Grandpa. It slipped out naturally, no hesitation, no correction. He handed the bottle across his throat, too tight for words. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't just a man eating breakfast, he was part of a family. After breakfast, Mrs. Henderson lingered with her tea. You know, Max, she said, her tone deliberate, what you did on Christmas, it spread further than you realize. People in town are still talking. Not about shame, but about courage. They're saying you gave a voice to every parent who's been taken for granted. Rosa nodded. You're not alone, Max. You have us. And you always will. Max looked around the room at Rosa, her grandson's Mrs. Henderson with her kind eyes, and realized something Ellen had told him years ago. Family isn't only blood, it's who shows up for you when you need them. Later that afternoon, they all bundled up and walked to the church down the street. The choir was practicing, voices spilling through stained glass windows. Inside, Max was greeted not as the lonely widower he'd once been, but with firm handshakes and warm embraces. Max, the pastor, called from across the aisle. Good to see you back. It felt different now. The pew didn't feel cold. The hymns didn't echo with emptiness. He wasn't alone, and he knew it. That night back at home, Max sat by the fire and reflected on the day. His phone sat on the mantel, dark and silent. No calls from Daniel. No messages from Jenna. He realized he didn't need them. Not the constant begging, not the hollow apologies. He had people who saw him, who valued him, who didn't measure his worth in dollars. He had a new kind of family neighbors who knocked on his door, friends who filled his silence with laughter, children who called him Grandpa without hesitation. Max leaned back in Ellen's chair and whispered to her photo on the mantel, "I finally listened to you, Ellen. I stopped giving so much to people who only take. And look what I found. The house didn't feel empty anymore. For the first time in years, it felt alive." It was a gray Saturday afternoon when Max heard a hesitant knock at the door. Not Rose's cheerful rap, not Mrs. Henderson's brisk tap. This one was softer, uneven, as if the visitor wasn't sure whether they belonged. Max opened the door to find a boy, no, not a boy anymore, but a young man standing awkwardly on the porch. 16, maybe 17, tall and thin, with eyes that mirrored Daniel's but carried a softness his son had long since lost. Are you Max?" the boy asked, clutching the strap of his backpack. Max's chest tightened. "Yes, I'm Max." "Who are you?" the young man swallowed, then spoke carefully. "I'm Samuel, your grandson." For a moment, Max couldn't move. The word hung in the cold air between them, heavier than any gift or burden. Grandson. He'd dreamed of holding that child, once had imagined bouncing him on his knee, telling him the same bedtime stories Ellen used to love. But Daniel and Jenna had cut him off before he ever got the chance. Now here he was, standing on his porch, shivering slightly in the December wind. "Come inside," Max managed, his voice breaking. Samuel stepped into the warm living room, glancing around like someone entering a museum. His eyes lingered on Ellen's photo on the mantel, on the handmade furniture, on the details of a house that seemed more alive than the ones he was used to. I had to come," Samuel said quickly, as if afraid he'd lose his nerve. "Dad and Mom, they never talk about you. But I found some old photos, and I heard neighbors whispering. They said you were the one who built this house, who paid for everything, and that you were cut out." Max sat down heavily in his chair, gesturing for Samuel to take the couch. "Your parents and I, we've had our differences." "That's what they said too," Samuel replied. "But it didn't sound like the truth. It sounded like something they were hiding. So I wanted to hear it from you." Max studied him. There was no malice in his grandson's face, only curiosity and a longing for connection that Max understood too well. So he told him, not in anger, not in bitterness, but in the steady, deliberate way he used to explain things to Daniel when he was a boy. He told Samuel about the mortgage payments, the years of sacrifice, the Christmas dinners where he sat alone. He told him about the betrayal, being told not to come because he would ruin the vibe. Samuel's eyes grew wet, his hands clenched into fists. "They told me you didn't care about us, that you were difficult. That's why you weren't around." Max shook his head slowly. "I've cared about you since before you were born. But sometimes, son, the truth gets buried under other people's pride." The boy looked down, wrestling with words bigger than his age. I think they were wrong." Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't heavy. It was the kind of silence that lets people breathe, the same air finally unguarded. After a while, Samuel asked, Can I come back, maybe for Christmas? I don't need presents or anything. I want to know you." Tears blurred Max's vision. He reached across the coffee table, placing his calloused hand over the boy's trembling one. "You'll always have a place here, Samuel?" "Always." Outside, snow began to fall again, soft flakes settling on the porch where Samuel had stood moments earlier. Inside by the fire, a bridge had been built, fragile, tentative, but real. For the first time in years, Max didn't feel erased. He felt seen. He felt remembered. And most of all, he felt like a grandfather at last. Samuel kept his word. At first, he came quietly, slipping over on weekends under the excuse of study groups or basketball practice. He and Max would share coffee and hot chocolate, sometimes a meal, sometimes just stories. Max showed him how to fix a loose hinge on a cabinet, how to sand wood with the grain, how to really listen to people, instead of waiting for your turn to speak. But small towns have eyes and neighbors have tongues. It wasn't long before Mrs. Henderson mentioned almost too loudly at the corner grocery, "Did you see Max with that young man, handsome boy? Looked just like Daniel in his youth." Another neighbor, Mr. Carmichael, chimed in, "That's his grandson. Isn't it good to see the boy finally visiting his grandfather after all the mess?" And just like that, whispers began weaving through the community, spreading faster than snow melting under winter sun. By the second week, Rosa stopped Max after church, her eyes shining. "So it's true, Samuel comes to you now." Max nodded, quietly humbled. "He does." Word spread from pew to pew, table to table. Soon Samuel's quiet visits became a symbol of something bigger. People saw it as redemption, as proof that blood could still find its way home, even after betrayal. Meanwhile, Daniel and Jenna couldn't escape the echoes. At the bank, Daniel overheard a teller whispering, "Isn't that the man whose son visits his father in secret? Now imagine that." At Jenna's workplace, a colleague mentioned, "I saw your boy with Max the other day. Sweet thing, the way he hugged his grandfather." Jenna's smile stiffened, but she couldn't hide the truth. People were talking, and they weren't taking her side. The humiliation was subtle, but it was relentless. At a holiday fundraiser, Daniel and Jenna found themselves standing alone, conversations around them, dipping into silence whenever they approached. Parents of Samuel's classmates were whispering, how could they treat their father like that? And yet their son is the one with the decency to reach out. The irony was bitter. The very boy they were raising under a cloud of half-truths had become a witness to their selfishness. And worse, his actions were making them look smaller, pettier, meaner. Max, for his part, did nothing to fan the flames. He didn't brag, didn't boast. He simply welcomed Samuel with warmth and let the boy see who he really was. But that quiet dignity spoke louder than any revenge. One evening, Samuel admitted, "Dad's furious. Mom, too. They told me I was being manipulated. But I know what I see when I'm here. I see love. I see honesty. They can't take that from me." Max placed a hand on his grandson's shoulder. "You have to choose what kind of man you want to be, Samuel. Don't let bitterness decide for you. But know this, you'll always be safe here." The boy's eyes shimmered with something Max hadn't seen in years' hope. By the time Christmas lights twinkled across the town, the story had grown beyond a whisper. It was a quiet kind of justice, delivered not by courtrooms or contracts, but by community judgment. People looked at Daniel and Jenna differently now, not with envy of their status, but with pity for their cruelty. And they looked at Max as something more than a forgotten old man. They saw him as the father who had given everything and the grandfather who still had love left to give. For Max, it wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about restoration. Samuel's visits had given him back his place in the world, not through confrontation, but through presence, through love that endured. And yet deep inside, Max knew there was one last act to come, an act that would bring everything full circle. The final Christmas dinner, where the whispers would no longer be whispers but truths laid bare. The town square glowed that evening, strings of golden lights wrapping every lamppost, the scent of cinnamon and pine drifting through the air. It was the Christmas Eve dinner hosted at the church hall, a tradition for the whole community. Max hadn't planned to attend, but when Samuel called that morning and said, "Grandpa, please come sit with me," he knew it was time. When he entered the hall, conversations faltered for a heartbeat. Then, one by one, people smiled and nodded, making space for him. Mrs. Henderson waved him over. Rosa pulled out a chair, and Samuel ran up and hugged him in full view of everyone. Daniel and Jenna arrived late, dressed in holiday finery. But instead of admiration, they met silence, whispers following them like shadows. They froze when they saw Samuel at Max's table, his arm around his grandfather. For the first time, Daniel looked small in front of his own son. The pastor tapped the microphone, calling for quiet. "Before we break bread, does anyone have words of thanks this Christmas?" To everyone's surprise, Samuel stood. His voice trembled but grew stronger with each word. "I want to thank my grandfather. He gave our family everything, and when I finally opened my eyes, I saw what love really looks like. It's not money. It's not status. It's sacrifice. And it's time people knew the truth. The hall went silent. Every face turned toward Daniel and Jenna. Max didn't rise, didn't gloat. He simply squeezed Samuel's shoulder, letting the boy's words hang in the air. That silence became the loudest judgment of all. Daniel's jaw tightened, Jenna's eyes flickered with shame. They had no defense, no escape. In that single moment, their status crumbled not by Max's hand, but by the truth their own son revealed. The community clapped not a loud cheer, but steady, affirming applause. For Max, for Samuel, for the quiet justice that had finally arrived. Max felt his throat tighten. He hadn't planned revenge to end this way. He had imagined papers burned or contracts torn in public. Instead, it was this dignity restored not through fire, but through love and truth spoken in the open. When the meal began, people filled his plate, poured his coffee, pulled him into conversations. Samuel never left his side beaming, as if he had reclaimed something precious. Max lifted his cup, his voice steady. "Merry Christmas, everyone. And thank you for reminding me that family is not always who shares your blood, but who stands with you in love." The crowd cheered softly, glasses raised. And in that moment, Max finally felt free. Later that night, standing outside under falling snow, Max looked up at the stars. He whispered, "Ellen, justice is done. Our boy knows the truth now, and I'm not alone anymore." The snow fell gently on his shoulders, not heavy but light like a blessing. And that, dear listeners, is the end of today's story. If it touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel, leaving a like, and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Your support keeps these stories alive. From my family to yours, I wish you peace, health, and the warmth of true love this season. May your days be filled with kindness, and may you always know who your real family is. Merry Christmas, and God bless.